Hi, Terry here, and welcome back to Times Gone Tech. Today, I'm starting episode 2 in my series on the history of energetic chemistry. But before I get into that, I'd like to do just a very quick addendum back on the previous first episode in this series that I did about mercury fulminate and its use as a primer and a detonator throughout the 19th, early 20th centuries. Got a lot of good comments on that video. Thank you very much. Got some good views. There was one comment that I really appreciated, and it was about the fact that mercury fulminate will react with aluminum. Remember, I said that I made up 136 percussion caps with the leftover fulminated mercury that I'd made. And that's true. And mercury fulminate does react with aluminum, copper, and brass, along with probably some other metals. And it produces what's called an amalgam, which is a mixture of different types of metals. Essentially, it just breaks down. It breaks down back into its constituent components, becomes inactive, um, just gets weak over time. And that time, depending on the metal and how much and what you're using it for, can be a few weeks to a few months, maybe a year at the most, depends. People back in the olden days did not buy and store ammunition like we tend to do today. They just didn't. Today, I know a couple of people who have 1,000 rounds or more of ammunition per gun just sitting on a shelf in storage. But back in those days, you'd buy a box of ammunition, you'd shoot it up, you'd buy another box. And from my own personal experience, I can remember my father, who grew up in the 1920s and 30s, telling me stories when he was a boy about his father would buy one box of 22 bullets during squirrel and rabbit season, one box of shotgun shells during duck and turkey seasons, and one box of 30-30 shells during deer season. And after the season was over, whatever he had left, he'd go out in the backyard and shoot it up. Why? Can't keep it. It won't be any good next year. And that's just the way it was then. My own father kept very little ammunition in the house, just an old habit, because they were clearly, this was modern times, 60s, 70s. And he could have stored up a lot of ammunition. He'd keep about one box, for each gun that he owned. And when that box was gone, he'd buy another box. So yeah, I made up 136 percussion caps, and then the very next day I went to the target range and I shot them all up. I don't keep a supply of homemade percussion caps. I do have some commercial caps that use lead styphnate, which have a good, long, stable shelf life. But those are getting hard to find, so I've stopped using them. I pretty much just keep those, for in case times get tough. And if I'm going to go to the range tomorrow, I'll figure out how long I'm going to expect to be there, how many rounds I think I might fire, and then I make up that many percussion caps today. So that's what I wanted to mention. Anybody who is thinking about maybe using fulminated mercury for making their own percussion caps, because it is, well, it's lead free, it's got mercury in it, but it's also non-corrosive. But first of all, I advise everybody, don't try and make and use fulminated mercury. It's not quite as easy as I may have made it look. And it only lasts a few weeks, a month, depending on what metal you're using. Copper tends to work out the best. It might last 6 months, all right? But if you're going to do it, which I advise you don't, but if you're going to, just make them up as you're going to need them. Don't make up a bunch of these things, put them on the shelf and think you can leave them there for 10 years. Enough said about that. On to today's video. Throughout the development of energetic chemistry through the 19th and into the 20th century, most of the inventions, discoveries, advancements made have been deliberately. These were experiments conducted by chemists who understood the science and the chemistry. They knew what they were doing, and they were able to accurately predict the result of their experiments. And you think about it, who would think of just mixing a specific type of metal with a specific type of a certain strength of acid, and then add that to a specific amount of a specific type and concentration of alcohol just to see what happens, right? I mean, these people knew what they were doing, or at least they had a very good idea, and they knew what was going to happen. But every once in a while, a happy accident happens that, as it turns out, has more of a revolutionary impact on the world civilization than any of these other deliberate experiments ever would have. And one of those happened in 1846. The story goes that one day in 1846, a German Swiss chemist by the name of Friedrich Schonbein was working in his kitchen with some concentrated nitric sulfuric acid. Well, that's not so surprising, though. I mean, everybody does that, right? But he accidentally spilled some, grabbed his wife's apron, cleaned it up, rinsed it out, and hung it up to dry over the stove. And when it had dried, the apron, which was made of cotton, did an amazing thing. It vanished in a huge puff of flame that produced almost no smoke and almost no ash. Schonbein called his discovery exploding cotton. Yeah, no, seriously though, that is what he actually called it. And in all fairness, though, people had been experimenting with nitrating different types of cellulose since back about 1832. So this whole concept was nothing new. And in fact, Schonbein wasn't even the first to, I guess, accidentally conduct this experiment. A man named John Hall actually beat him to it the same year. And actually, Schonbein wasn't even the first to publish his findings or even apply for a patent. Hall beat him to that as well. John Hall went with the name Exploding Cotton and immediately set up a factory to mass produce it for the purpose of replacing gunpowder, what we now today call black powder, in mining, blasting, and quarrying operations. The problem was neither Hall, his business partners, and they always seemed to have business partners back in those days, but neither he, his business partners, or the factory workers themselves seemed to have really understood exactly what it was they were dealing with. Very few safeties were put in place. And unfortunately, there was an explosion which killed almost 24 people. This had such a devastating effect on Hall that he shut operations down for almost 15 years. So other people could experiment with it. They could even make it and sell it, but they still had to pay him a royalty. But he shut his operation down for 15 years. Now, during that period, it was finally learned what they'd done wrong. Safety procedures were put in place. Safe procedures for manufacturing this exploding cotton were developed, and it was brought back online as a replacement for gunpowder in blasting and mining operations. So, how did it get to be called gun cotton? Well, because at the same time, it was also discovered that it made a great replacement for gunpowder in exploding artillery shells. Artillery pieces were known as guns, so gun cotton. And really, I mean, gun cotton sounds way more cool. Even nitrocellulose, right? Sounds way more cool than exploding cotton. Come on. If gun cotton was invented or discovered in 1846, why did it take so long for smokeless powder to come out in the 1880s? Well, there were some problems with gun cotton, most notably gun cotton itself. Gun cotton generates 6 times the amount of gas per volume as gunpowder does, 6 times the chamber pressures. Now remember, this is back in the 1840s. Sam Colt was experimenting with the Walker, the Dragoons. Um, they had a habit of exploding just using gunpowder. The problem with using a more powerful propellant was the steel at the time just simply wasn't strong enough. They didn't have good, high quality steel castings. So it was really a twofold problem. It was that they had this really cool, almost completely smokeless propellant, but the steel available at the time simply couldn't handle it. So two things had to happen. The quality of the steel had to improve, and somebody had to figure out a way to tone down the power of the gun cotton a little bit. So what was needed was some way to sort of standardized or to make it more consistent, make it burn more evenly, more controllably, and at the same time increase the quality of the steel to handle the higher chamber pressures. It was a real problem. And of course, that brings us to the point in the video where I just got to make some of this stuff and see what all that brouhaha was about. So let's get started. Okay, so to do this, I'm going to need to create what's called a nitrating solution or nitrating acid, it's also called. And that's just a mixture of concentrated nitric and sulfuric acid. Now, the thing about mixing nitric and sulfuric acid together is when they mix, they generate a lot of heat. It's an exothermic reaction. Now, there's very little risk of an actual explosion, but if the temperatures get too high, the nitric acid can start breaking down, first producing nitric oxide and water. That water can then turn into steam, and the steam can essentially explode, throwing hot concentrated acid everywhere. So I started by pre-chilling both the nitric and the sulfuric acid in the freezer down below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, right above freezing, actually, just above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I've now got them in an ice bath, and I've added some salt to the nitric acid to help really keep it cold. I'm going to mix the sulfuric acid with the nitric acid slowly. I'm going to monitor it with a thermometer while constantly stirring. Keep that temperature down below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, I got some extra ice here if I need it. I've got some water here with a 5% baking soda solution in it, just in case I need to, get some splashed on my hands or something. And I've got a 5-gallon bucket of water I'm going to put down here. Is my dump bucket, just in case I need it. I can just scrape everything off into that bucket and run. And this time I will be wearing safety goggles. I know that's making all you self-appointed safety ranger bobs out there happy. I wear PPE according to the risk involved. Low risk, low PPE. So we're going to start by just very, very slowly pouring the acid, sulfuric acid, into the nitric acid. Watch the temperature. We're up to a little too warm already. Back down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Add a little more acid, a little more sulfuric acid, temperature going right back up. Okay, now we're done with that. You see the smoke there. It's got a little warm, that last bit. Okay, our temperature is stabilized at right at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is the nitrating acid that Schoenbein, as the story goes, spilled on his kitchen table, grabbed his wife's apron, or in this case, 5 grams of cotton, and cleaned it up. We're just going to drop this down in there and let it soak for 90 seconds. And done. Now we're going to drop it in the baking soda solution, and you can see it. It's not actually boiling. That is bubbling. It's the baking soda neutralizing the acid. And there it is. That will neutralize the acid, stop the reaction, stop the nitration process. Because if we over nitrate it, it'll turn to mush and become essentially useless. So once this has stopped reacting, I'll know that all of the acid has been absorbed. Then I'm going to take it in the house and I'm going to wash it. wash the baking soda out. Now, some people um, don't like to use the baking soda. They want to just wash the acid out. And the risk with that is if you don't get all of the acid washed out, as it's drying, the remaining nitric acid will react with the nitrates in the copper and can self-ignite at room temperature. And I think personally, that's one of the mistakes that John Hall made in his manufacturing process. I would rather have a little excess baking soda left over than a little excess nitric acid that I didn't get cleaned out completely. This acid will be disposed of, again, using more baking soda. I'll just pour baking soda solution into it. First, I'll dilute it in my dump bucket, then I'll mix in some baking soda with it. And that's got it. And I can feel a difference in the cotton. It's more, I don't know, it feels more dense, like it's solidified. Very, very interesting. So I'll take this inside and put it in my kitchen sink and start rinsing it. So here it is, rinsing in my kitchen sink. And I'm just going to let that run for 30 minutes. But keep in mind that I'm not really washing out nitric and sulfuric acid at this point. I've already neutralized that with the baking soda solution. I'm just making sure I get all that baking soda out. Well, here it is, washed, cleaned, dried, ready to use. Now, that's just some of it. I've already burned up some of it, coming up in an upcoming demonstration. Now, the thing about this is, while it looks light and fluffy, it looks kind of like cotton, it doesn't really look and feel exactly like cotton. It's not as light and fluffy as cotton is. It's got a different texture to it. Not exactly the same. So let's try some out. Let's start by burning some regular cotton. And you can see it does burn, but slowly, and it doesn't produce a lot of smoke either. And it burns down, and here comes the inspector. It produces a little smoke when the flame goes out. Yeah, that's not something you want to play with, is it? And you'll notice that it continues kind of sparking and smoldering, and as it slowly burns, it's still burning, it's just not producing an open flame. Now, let's try a little gun cotton. And you see it burn, does leave a little more soot, but not much, and it burned up a lot faster. But while it did burn a lot faster than regular cotton, it didn't explode, right? But if you recall from Schoenbein's tale, his wife's apron didn't explode either. It went up in a big bush of flame, right, producing almost no smoke and almost no soot, just like this did. In the open, gun cotton is actually kind of unimpressive. Where it really shows its teeth is when it's confined. So what's going on here? Well, first, it's important to note that 5 grams of cotton that I started with originally finished up at weighing 7 grams. Now, that's almost a 50% increase in weight. Where'd all that extra mass come from? Came from nitrogen in the nitric acid bonding with the fibers of the cellulose. And there's the key to what's happening. When you take a material like gunpowder, for example, we've got 3 ingredients serving different functions. We've got the potassium nitrate as the oxidizer, charcoal as the fuel, and then sulfur as the igniter. Now, separately, they might smolder a little bit. Sulfur burns slowly, like the cotton kind of burnt slowly. But when you combine them together in just the right proportions, you get a very vigorous reaction, and it goes up in a big puff of hot gas and flame and smoke, and leaves a little soot behind. And that's because no matter how well The three ingredients are mixed together, and no matter how tightly they're compressed together, they're still completely separate ingredients. The sulfur is always just sulfur. The charcoal is always just charcoal. And they can be separated out from each other again fairly easily. And that makes it very inefficient. And all that smoke and soot that you see is actually unburned charcoal, most of it, and some is potassium nitrate. But with gun cotton, when we nitrate something, we're bonding nitrogen from the nitric acid right into the fibers of the material itself. So the cells of the cotton itself becomes the oxidizer, the fuel, and the igniter. And that lets it burn much more efficiently, producing a lot more gas and very little soot. So as it turns out, gun cotton was just way too powerful to be used as a propellant in firearms or even cannons at the time, simply because the quality of the steel just wasn't up to the job. It would have to wait about 40 years before a method was developed that could actually tone it down a little, and the quality of the steel could actually increase enough to handle those higher chamber pressures. And if it hadn't been for a little happy accident that happened in the 1870s, gun cotton might have just been a minor footnote in history, instead of, as I believe, one of, if not the single most influential and important discoveries of the entire 19th and 20th centuries. But that's in another episode. Hey, thanks for watching. See you next time.